You have prayed over this door 3 times this month and it still will not open. The job offer stalled. The conversation you needed to have got postponed again. The ministry idea you felt so sure about has hit a wall of scheduling conflicts, a broken laptop, and a friend who suddenly stopped returning your calls. Someone in your prayer group said the word out loud, and it landed like an explanation. Spiritual attack. The enemy doesn't want you to succeed. Of course he's resisting you. You're finally doing something that matters. It's a tidy story. It makes the delay feel meaningful instead of just frustrating. And it might even be partly true. But you never went back and checked whether the laptop broke because you dropped it, whether the friend stopped calling because of something you said, or whether the job stalled because your application was late. You skipped straight to the enemy, because the enemy was a more spiritual explanation than I made a mistake, or this is just how hard things are sometimes. So here's the real question underneath all the delay and resistance you're facing right now. How do you know whether you're standing against the enemy or standing in the way of your own solution and calling it warfare? You've heard the answer already, and it's not wrong on its own. The Christian life involves real spiritual opposition. Paul says plainly that we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. He tells the Thessalonians that he wanted to come to them again and again, but Satan hindered us. Something genuinely resisted him. A real obstruction, named plainly as spiritual. So the instinct isn't invented out of nowhere. Scripture does describe a category of resistance that comes from the enemy, aimed specifically at faithful obedience. When you're doing something that matters to God's kingdom, reconciling a relationship, starting a ministry, breaking a sin pattern, obeying a hard calling, it would be naive to assume nothing spiritual is ever pushing back. This answer feels right because it has biblical roots. It just isn't the whole passage. Here's what the "it's always spiritual warfare" instinct quietly skips. In the very same letter where Paul names Satan as the hinderer, he also spends chapters talking about ordinary human responsibility, working with your hands, living quietly, and examining yourselves. Paul didn't treat every closed door the same way. He named the ones he believed were spiritual, and he left the others alone. Let's see Numbers 13 and 14. 10 of the 12 spies stood at the edge of the promised land and reported giants, fortified cities, and an impossible task. Was that spiritual warfare? In one sense, unbelief is always spiritual. But their report wasn't wrong about the difficulty. The cities really were fortified. The people really were large. What made it sin wasn't misreading the obstacle. It was concluding from a real obstacle that God couldn't be trusted with it. Now look at Nehemiah, rebuilding the wall. Sanballat and Tobiah mock him, threaten him, and plot against him. Real spiritual and human opposition. And Nehemiah names it as such and prays about it directly. But in that same chapter, Nehemiah also posts guards, arms the builders, and organizes a watch schedule. He doesn't pray instead of preparing. He can tell the difference between this is opposition and this is a reason to stop being wise. It's not that spiritual warfare isn't real, it's that treating every fatigue, every delay, every conflict, and every closed door as automatically demonic collapses 2 very different categories into one, and it quietly removes your responsibility from the equation every time. Scripture doesn't give you a formula for telling the difference, but it gives you a pattern. Watch how Paul, Nehemiah, Joseph, and even Balaam's donkey handle resistance differently, and the pattern starts to show itself. First, spiritual resistance in Scripture is usually tied to something specific and identifiable. Faithful obedience already in motion, not just difficulty in general. Paul names Satan's hindrance in the context of a specific, repeated desire to return to a specific church he had already been serving. The pattern isn't, everything is hard lately. It's, I tried this particular thing, aimed at this particular obedience, more than once, and something kept stopping it. Second, real spiritual opposition doesn't usually erase your responsibility. It sits alongside it. Nehemiah prays and posts a watch. He doesn't use "the enemy is against us" as a reason to stop planning. If naming something as a spiritual attack becomes your reason to stop examining your own choices, stop preparing wisely, or stop taking correction, that's a signal you may have mislabeled the obstacle. Third, not every obstacle that later proves purposeful was ever framed by Scripture as an attack to be resisted. Look at Joseph, sold by his brothers, falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, and forgotten in prison for 2 years, a chain of obstacles that would be easy to call demonic at any point along the way. But when Joseph finally names what happened, he doesn't say the enemy meant it for evil. He says his brothers meant it for evil, and God meant it for good. The obstruction was human and circumstantial, jealousy and a forgetful cupbearer, and God was sovereign over all of it, without any of it requiring the label spiritual attack. Sometimes the honest biblical category for a painful delay isn't warfare at all. It's providence working through ordinary human sin and ordinary human forgetfulness. Fourth, look back at your own decisions before you look up at the enemy. Go back to your Numbers 13 report. Is the obstacle actually a fortified city or a normal-sized difficulty that fear has enlarged? Ask what a wise, sober-minded friend who loves you enough to be honest would say if they looked at the broken laptop, the late application, and the friend who stopped calling. Sometimes the honest answer is, this is a consequence. Sometimes it's this. This is just how growth and timing work. Sometimes it's you who needs to apologize. None of those require an enemy. Even the strange story of Balaam's donkey makes this point almost comically. Balaam thinks the donkey is simply being disobedient and beats it 3 times, when in fact an angel with a drawn sword is blocking the road, invisible to Balaam but plain to the donkey. Sometimes what looks like an ordinary obstacle really is spiritual. But it took God opening Balaam's eyes to reveal that. Balaam didn't get there by assuming. He got there when the reality was actually shown to him. That's humility's job in this whole question. Not to guess confidently in either direction, but to stay teachable about which one you're facing. Here's the part worth paying attention to. Calling everything spiritual warfare can be a way of avoiding responsibility without feeling like you're avoiding it. If the enemy is blocking the door, you don't have to ask whether you prepared well. If the enemy is against the relationship, you don't have to ask whether you were unkind. If the enemy hates the calling, the timing, the skill gap, and the flawed plan, they can all stay unexamined. Naming it spiritual feels like courage. I'm being persecuted for doing right, while functioning like an escape hatch from correction. It's a strange kind of relief. You get to feel targeted instead of at fault. There's a second danger too, and it runs the other direction. Some people are so afraid of sounding superstitious or dramatic that they refuse to name real spiritual opposition even when it's there, and end up facing genuine spiritual battles with purely natural strategies. More effort, more willpower, more hustle, while never once turning to actual prayer. Both errors come from the same root, a reluctance to hold 2 things true at once. The world is genuinely spiritual, and you are genuinely responsible. Neither truth cancels the other. The moment you use one to escape the other, you've stopped listening to the whole counsel of Scripture and started listening to whichever half makes you feel better right now. One caution matters here. This isn't a tool for minimizing someone else's fear. If someone tells you they're afraid of a person, a pattern, or an environment that has actually harmed them, maybe it's not really spiritual warfare, is not yours to hand them. This discernment is for your own obstacles, examined honestly and humbly, not a way to talk another person out of a danger they can see more clearly than you can. What do you actually do the next time a door won't open? Start with the ordinary questions before the spiritual ones. Was there a mistake here? A missed deadline? An unclear message? An unwise decision? Or a broken relationship you haven't repaired? Write down the actual sequence of events before you interpret them. What happened first? What happened next? And what you did at each point along the way. Ask someone who knows you well enough to tell you the truth, not just someone who will agree with your read of the situation. The people most likely to affirm it's definitely spiritual warfare are often the people least likely to have seen the missed deadline or the unkind email. Ask the person who has actually watched you work, not just the person who wants to encourage you. Check whether the pattern is specific or general. Real spiritual resistance in Scripture tends to cluster around a particular obedience. Paul's specific desire to return to Thessalonica, Nehemiah's specific work on the wall. If every single thing you attempt in every area of life meets resistance, that points less toward a targeted spiritual assault and more towards something worth examining in how you plan, communicate, or follow through. If the ordinary explanation genuinely doesn't account for what's happening, if you've prepared well, acted wisely, and treated people rightly, and the resistance is still specifically aimed at something you know is faithful obedience, then pray about it as what it might be. Ephesians 6 doesn't tell you to analyze the enemy. It tells you to put on armor and stand. That's active trust, not passive fatalism. And whichever category it turns out to be, keep doing the Nehemiah thing. Pray and prepare. Examine yourself and watch for real opposition. Stay willing to be wrong in either direction, the way Balaam eventually was. None of this discernment is something you have to earn the right to. Christ has already disarmed the powers and authorities, triumphing over them, which means the armor of God in Ephesians 6 isn't a weapon you're building from scratch under pressure. It's a covering you're stepping into, because the decisive battle is already won. You're not discerning your way toward victory. You're discerning your way through a world where the outcome is already secured by someone else's obedience, not your own correct guess. Go back to that door that hasn't opened yet. You don't have to decide today, with total certainty, whether it's the enemy, or a mistake, or simply not time yet. What you can do is stop reaching for the most spiritual-sounding explanation as a way of skipping the harder, humbler work of asking what's actually true. God is not distant from either kind of obstacle. He's present in the ordinary, unglamorous work of preparation and correction just as much as he is present in the battle Paul described. He was present in Joseph's prison cell without a single angelic confrontation recorded, just years of quiet faithfulness inside a wrong that other people caused. Naming the difference honestly isn't a lesser form of faith. It's what lets you actually fight the real battles, instead of exhausting yourself fighting the wrong one or missing the real one entirely because you assumed you already knew which it was. Tonight, before you pray about the door again, ask one honest question first. Is there something here I need to fix or make right before I ask God to move an enemy who might not be the one standing in the way? If you know someone who's been calling every hard season a spiritual attack and quietly avoiding the ordinary work that might actually open the door, send them this. Not to accuse them of unbelief, but to hand them a question worth sitting with honestly.